You're listening to the Diplomat's podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, back in Washington, D.C.
And I am your co-host, Katie Putz, also in Washington, D.C.
Hey, Katie, it's good to be back. I know we took a little bit of an extended summer break, but I'm sure our listeners are ready for a little discussion, so thanks for joining me.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Summer has hit here in Washington and elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, I guess, but
Yeah,
plenty to discuss.
absolutely. Actually, so I was just on vacation for a little bit, and I left DC the day that Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to town, and that's actually what we'll talk about today because it's definitely, I think, the summit that happened between Modi and Biden, or rather the state visit, I should say, is, I think, an important moment in the U.S.-India relationship, which we've repeatedly covered on this podcast over the years, but I don't think we've actually done a dedicated U.S.-India episode in several months now. So this seems like a good moment to kind of take stock of what happened, what's driving the U.S.-India relationship at this particular moment in time, and how the two countries really see each other in this rapidly changing geopolitical context in Asia and globally. So I think the place to begin is maybe just a quick kind of rundown of, well, not everything that happened, because there was certainly a lot from, a joint address to Congress to a whole range of deliverables. But basically, I think, Katie, if I had to sum up let's say the three banner kind of headings for the 2023 U.S. India state visit, or Modi state visit to Washington, I'd say the banner headlines here are technology, defense, and kind of the way, I don't know the right way to maybe say this, but people to people ties, U.S. India relations more broadly kind of expanding. I think this is part of a process, of course, of U.S. India convergence that has now been ongoing for, depending on the date you want to backdate it to, I would say about 2 decades. There's been pretty consistent support for the U.S.-India relationship across administrations, and the Biden administration has really been no exception there. On technology, I think there were sort of deliverables on semiconductors, which have been a major priority for the Biden administration, setting up new assembly and test facilities in India. Micron Technology, in particular, is establishing a new center that was announced out of the visit. There's a new partnership on critical minerals. India joined up to the Mineral Security Partnership, which is, again, I think, an attempt by the United States to ensure that New Delhi is looped into that important strategic U.S. initiative. There's a lot on telecommunications, on space. India signed the Artemis Accords, which is a big deal. We won't go into that in too much detail, but certainly India joining Artemis is a pretty significant development. It becomes the 27th country, I believe, to join that initiative, which is led by NASA in the United States. There were a couple deliverables on quantum, on other forms of innovation, kind of following up on the initiative on critical and emerging technologies that the two countries announced fairly recently. The big headline on defense, of course, there are two big headlines on defense. The first one, which I think is really the crystallization of the U.S.-India major defense partnership, which was announced at the end of the Obama administration in 2016, is the fact that India will be producing or co-producing with the United States General Electric F-414 fighter jet engines, including engines that will power Indian fighter aircraft built by Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. That's a really big deal. It's, I think, the kind of cooperation that India has been hoping to capitalize on. And the other big defense headline, of course, is that the two countries finalized a deal for the provision of General Atomics MQ-9B armed Sea Guardian UAVs, which is also a deal that's been pending for some time. So let me stop there. I've kind of talked through, Katie, a little bit of the deliverables, the big banner headlines. This is a continuation of a long-running trend of convergence between the two countries. But of course, the U.S.-India relationship, I think, has raised questions, right? I mean, you've seen a lot of commentary, including in the Diplomat, about the divergence in values between the two countries, right? U.S. officials, of course, don't refer to this directly, where India is touted as the world's largest democracy and an important U.S.
Hmm.
partner. But increasingly, there is a divergence in values. There's, of course, widespread questioning of India's democratic credentials. I thought maybe you could kind of reflect a little bit on that, because I think that's an important component of this visit. We had kind of several members of Congress decline to attend Modi's joint address. I think the significance of this overall is still quite limited on the broader strategic trajectory of the relationship, but I do think it deserves to be addressed. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think your outline was very good in sort of identifying the technology and the defense aspects that came out of this summit. And then there was sort of that third area you identified, which is the more softer, like relationship between India and in the US and Indian people and American people that was very much highlighted. I think one of the interesting things is in the weeks ahead of the visit, as sort of commentators in the Diplomat, as you noted, and elsewhere, sort of pointed out this sort of ideological friction or just values friction, where you have sort of the reality in India, particularly for Muslims, but there's also issues with press freedoms in India, um, contrasted with this idea of India as a great democracy. No democracy is perfect, including ours, but I think there is definitely some tension there. But in the weeks ahead of the visit, various U.S. officials sort of stressed that, of course, Biden would address these concerns about human rights issues privately with Modi, but wouldn't lecture India about these issues. And so I think there's a very careful line being trod between raising these kinds of issues in a private manner and maybe trying to deepen that personal relationship between Biden and Modi, in hopes of maybe nudging some of those issues. I don't know if that's going to be successful, but there's this overarching strategic necessity of the relationship with India, and I think we see this time and again with sort of American values-led diplomacy, often taking a backseat to strategic and sort of these realist necessities. And so I think we very much see that. We did
Mhm.
not see Biden lecturing India about press freedoms,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think, and maybe one interesting sort of similarity between the two is both Biden and Modi don't really do a lot of press conferences. They don't really take questions from the press, so maybe they get along a little bit better in having that sort of approach. But I think it's worth remarking on because even in the joint statement, for example, it's heavily stressed repeatedly that this is, quote, a partnership of democracies looking into the 21st century with hope, ambition, and confidence. uh, if that's built on sort of a false premise that India is as democratic as the United States, or its democracy is as advanced as the United States, I don't know how long that can go before it gets a little bit absurd.
Yeah, I mean, the Biden administration, I think, has been getting some flack for this, given that, this is the administration that came in right after the Trump administration, after January 6th in the United States, emphasized restoring democracy, building back better, holding a democracy summit.
Hmm.
But also in the national security strategy that the administration released, it's quite frank. The NSS says that the U.S. will cooperate where needed with non-democracies and other countries where it advances U.S.
Hmm.
interests. And I think India, of course, everything that we've been talking about, the U.S. treats India as if it is, largely speaking, a democracy without the kinds of flaws that commentators have been talking about. But I think even through that frame, I think that broadly justifies why the administration, I think, continues to approach India as it does. Apart from that, I mean, there's, of course, the China factor, right, which is, I think, looming over this entire state visit. Right.
Hmm.
We've, of course, covered the precipitous decline in India-China relations since violence along their disputed border in the Himalayas, particularly in June 2020, when the violence escalated into armed hostilities that resulted in direct casualties and fatalities for the first time for the first time in several decades. And now we're in a position where I think the Biden administration takes the old U.S. kind of strategic bet view towards India, that even if India will never be a formal U.S. treaty ally or fully in line with U.S. interests across the board, right? I mean, that's, again, worth pointing out that India's relationship with Vladimir Putin's Russia has been a constant kind of vexing factor since the war in Ukraine began. But despite those divergences, despite the lack of a formal alliance, the U.S. has essentially made a strategic bet that a stronger, better equipped, more prosperous India is an inherent good for the United States in the Indo-Pacific, insofar as it gives China something else to concern itself with, and to the extent that India can directly offset China in an important way. Even if, Indian naval ships and aircraft aren't going to be showing up to a conflict on the Korean Peninsula or the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. still sees India as an important bulwark for whatever you want to call it, the free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think that's very much at play here. Kurt Campbell, the president's Indo-Pacific Affairs advisor at the National Security Council, termed the U.S.-India relationship the most important for the United States, which is really kind of a stark assessment when you think about it, given that, this is a country that's not actually a formal treaty ally, whereas the U.S., of course, has allies in NATO and Japan and South Korea that it, often uses very similar language to. But there's certainly, I think, folks in the administration who do see India as an absolutely essential country. But of course, the constant debate that's been playing out in the opinion pages, again, including at the Diplomat, is the extent to which this strategic bet will actually pay off for the United States when it's most needed, right? And so, will India ever be, willing to devote military assets to a campaign in the Taiwan Strait, right? Probably not, given everything we've seen so far. But, will this relationship still pay dividends for the United States? And I think that's going to be a continuing debate and conversation going forward. I think, Katie, it would be useful if we could talk a little bit actually about what happened right after this summit, which was not something that really made huge headlines in the United States, but was, of course, the SCO summit meeting, which India was leading this time. And I thought I'd turn it over to you because I know you spent a lot of time thinking about the SCO in particular. What do we take away from that when it comes to kind of India's particular role in Asia more broadly outside of the so-called, Team Indo-Pacific stuff with the United States? India certainly continues to be omni-aligned in many ways, and I think the SCO summit was an important reminder of that.
Yeah, so the SCO summit was particularly interesting this year for how absolutely sort of overlooked it was, and I have a feeling that that was almost on purpose on the part of India. So for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has a long history, which I'm not going to totally recount, but India and Pakistan joined this at the same time in 2017. This was India's first summit as a member of hosting a summit as a member of the SCO. And it was initially supposed to be held in person, but back in May, so a little bit, about a month and a half before the summit, India said it's going to be virtual. And so this summit took place entirely virtually, which is a reversion. The 2020 summit was held virtually because of the COVID pandemic. 2021 was in Dushanbe, I believe, and it was some people were in person, some people were virtual. And then last year, the summit was hosted by Uzbekistan and Samarkand, and that was entirely in person. And that the fact that India then sort of went back to this virtual format, I think speaks pretty loudly. There are a couple of lines of thought on why India, of course, did not actually say why it decided to pursue a virtual summit. There's sort of the first thing many people think of is what's the best way to put this? The optics of inviting Vladimir Putin to the country. Now, India is not a member of the ICC, so they're not obligated to arrest Vladimir Putin, even because there's an arrest warrant out for the guy. They're not, but there is an optical problem with bringing Putin and having that one-on-one with Modi and all of that. So going virtual sort of eschews doing that. But more importantly, there were questions about whether Xi Jinping would come, about whether Shehbaz Sharif would come, whether the Chinese and the Pakistani leaders would want to come to India for this summit and would engage. And so ultimately they held it virtually. The summit concluded with its usual joint statement, but as also has become habit, although most of the statement reads, the members all agree on whole litany of things. When it comes to the BRI and endorsing the BRI, India leaves itself out, and so that's a kind of an interesting thing for a
Mm-hmm.
summit conclusion to sort of leave one of the members out. But there's plenty to talk about there. But I think for our purposes here, the difference in profile between Modi's visit to the United States and then this summit in which was supposed to take place in India but took place on the internet. I think that tells us a little bit something about where India is positioning itself. It's not fully withdrawing from these engagements with Russia and China, but it's not wholly comfortable in them either. At least that's sort of the judgment I've come away with.
Yeah, no,
Do you have any thoughts about that?
yeah, no, I was just gonna say. I mean, I agree with that assessment, right? I mean, I use the term omni alignment to kind of describe India's broader approach. I think while that's still true in the sense that India is a country that certainly is willing to engage, kind of both, I guess all sides of the current geopolitical divergences, insofar as at least the Russia-U.S. divide is concerned. I think India, has effectively decided that closer cooperation with the United States, where it suits India's interests, will be pursued in a energetic and kind of full-throated way. And I think that's what we really take away from this summit, right? There's no doubt that the U.S. and India have their differences, but I think there was a conscious effort at the summit for both sides to kind of make sure that that wasn't really the emphasis, right? I think both Biden and Modi, their staff, kind of leading up to this summit, made sure that the optics would be on the broader strategic convergence of interests that exists between the two countries, when it comes to China, when it comes to other issues, even while differences will persist. But I think that SCO observation you made is right on, right? India's not going anywhere. They will continue to engage with Central Asia, which is also another priority for India. India has a policy of, for its own interests, connecting itself more closely with Central Asia. That's a policy that predates, the fall of the Afghan government to the Taliban. It's been something that the Indian government's been working on for a couple decades. So there's a lot at work there, but I think that kind of sums things up nicely.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the last reflection I'll make on the SEO is that, although I still think the plurality and the reason this SEO existed was Central Asia, the organization continues to grow and sort of contains multitudes. Iran joined this year as an official member. Belarus is expected to join next year as an official member. And so it's really grown beyond Central Asia, which as a Central Asianist, I find interesting and possibly problematic because it doesn't really address the issues in Central Asia anymore. It's kind of gotten, I think, a little bit unwieldy, but we will continue to watch and hopefully learn what the heck's going on.
Yeah, and speaking of Central Asia, Katie, maybe we can give our listeners a preview of our next episode because you just were in the region and you've just come back. So hopefully we'll be able to revisit some of your impressions and insights on Central Asia when we come back next week.
Yes, indeed. I just got back from Bishkek, and I'm very excited to talk about China, Russia, the United States in Central Asia because there's a lot going on, and the EU, which always gets forgotten, but probably shouldn't be.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll leave it there for today. Again, apologies to listeners for the protracted break, but summer happens, and we'll try to make up for it with a better tempo, at least through the rest of July. But in the meantime, thanks as always for listening. If you like the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you can keep up with future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. We really do appreciate the feedback. And if you have suggestions for either me or Katie on anything you'd like us to cover on the podcast going forward, please do reach out to us, social media, email. We'll be very happy to take that into consideration. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.